In the archives of the South Carolina Historical Society, bound in cracked, dry leather, lie the ledgers of Charleston's commerce. For the year 1847, they meticulously record over 3,000 transactions from the city's notorious slave auctions. Each entry is a life, reduced to a line of cursive script: age, sex, price, buyer. But on the page for April 14th, in a sale conducted by an auctioneer named Samuel Pritchard, there is an entry that pulls at the eye, a detail that feels wrong. Over the decades, 3 separate researchers have flagged this single transaction. The physical description doesn't quite align with the gender assigned. The buyer's signature appears to have been traced, a phantom hand guiding the original. The bill of sale itself was amended twice, in 2 different shades of ink, as if arguing with itself. But the true horror of this story isn't found in the disquiet of old paperwork. It begins 8 months later, hundreds of miles away, at a place called Riverwood Plantation in Hanover County, Virginia. It's there that a physician, Dr. Howard Kemp, filed a frantic private report with the county magistrate, a report so disturbing it was immediately sealed by court order. Dr. Kemp then packed his bags, fled the state, and was never known to practice medicine again. That report, and the full story of what transpired at Riverwood, has remained buried. It's a story pieced together from the fragile pages of private family letters, the hushed testimony of slaves recorded in a secret tribunal, and the cryptic, final diary entries of a woman who chose to take her own life rather than face what her husband had planned for her. Before we unearth the story of Riverwood Plantation and the single transaction that would ultimately destroy every life it touched, I want to know where you're listening from. Leave a comment and tell me what city or state you're in right now. Is anyone watching from the Virginia soil where this all took place? Or from South Carolina, where the fuse was first lit? Let me know. Now, let us return to where it began. The spring of 1847 found Hanover County, Virginia, in a state of what you might call cautious prosperity. The rich, red earth just north of Richmond yielded a strain of tobacco that commanded a premium on the markets in Europe. Hogsheads of cured leaf rolled down the winding James River, a constant flow of capital that kept the great houses standing and the fields full. Riverwood Plantation was one of the largest of these great houses, a sprawling 800 acres of prime land, bordered by ancient oaks, that had seen a century of Vanderhorst ambition. The main house, built in 1798, stood 3 stories of whitewashed brick and aging timber, its grand columns weathered to a ghostly grayish cream. 12 windows faced south, greedy for the winter sun, and a wide porch wrapped around its heart like a cage. From that porch, one could see the fields, the source of all the family's wealth and all its sorrow. By 1847, Riverwood belonged to Isaiah Vanderhorst. At 43, he was an imposing figure in county society, a man built with the broad shoulders and thick hands of someone who had once worked the land himself, before legacy and expectation had softened him. His dark hair was just beginning to frost at the temples, a distinguished look he paired with the fashionable mutton-chop sideburns of the Virginia gentry. But his appearance was a carefully maintained facade. Anyone who knew Isaiah, truly knew him, could see the change in his eyes. Once bright with the fire of a young planter's ambition, they now held a hollow, haunted quality. The light in them had gone out in 1844, the year his first wife, Sarah, had died. She'd succumbed to a fever just 5 days after delivering their 3rd stillborn child. Isaiah never spoke her name again. He walled her off in his memory, just as he walled off her bedroom, leaving it as a perfect, silent shrine to his failure. The household slaves whispered about it, how her hairbrush still sat on the vanity, tangled with her last shed strands of hair, how her final piece of needlework remained stretched in its frame, a single unfinished stitch hanging loose. The grief had not broken Isaiah. It had petrified him. He'd always been a stern master, but the loss carved away what little softness he had, leaving something brittle and cold in its place. He became a man whose silences were more terrifying than his shouts. The plantation ran on the labor of 43 enslaved people, their lives governed by the rhythm of the seasons and the moods of their master. The household was managed with quiet, fearful efficiency by an elderly woman named Patience. She had been Sarah's personal maid, and before that, she had known Isaiah as a boy. If anyone understood the chilling transformation in him, it was Patience. But she was a woman who had survived by burying her observations deep where no one could find them. Into this house of grief and silence, in the spring of 1847, came a new bride. The pressure to remarry had been immense. At 43, Isaiah had no heirs. Riverwood, the Vanderhorst legacy, demanded a son. His mother, Constance, a formidable matriarch living in Charleston, had taken it upon herself to arrange the matter. The chosen bride was Catherine Shelby, the 26-year-old daughter of a once proud Albemarle County family that had fallen on hard times. By Virginia's cruel standards, Catherine was dangerously close to spinsterhood. She wasn't a conventional beauty. Her features were too sharp, her frame too slender, her gaze too intelligent and direct. But she was educated, dignified, and, most importantly, she came from good stock and was of childbearing age. Her family, desperate, accepted Isaiah's proposal with minimal negotiation. They were married on March 16th in a small, joyless ceremony at St. Paul's Episcopal Church. Catherine arrived at Riverwood with 2 trunks of belongings and a lady's maid named Dinah, a free woman of color who had been with the Shelby family for over a decade. The early weeks of the marriage were a study in stilted formality. Isaiah was not cruel to her, but he was a ghost in his own home. He was a master, a husband, but not a companion. He would visit her room at night, performing his marital duty with a mechanical, detached efficiency, and then retreat to his own chambers, leaving her alone in the cavernous, unfamiliar dark. There was no tenderness, no conversation. Catherine understood her role with painful clarity. She was there to manage his household, carry his heir, and maintain the fragile veneer of a proper Virginia marriage. But the isolation of Riverwood was suffocating. It was a beautiful prison, and she was its solitary inmate. The house staff, led by Patience, treated her with a cool, distant respect. She was the replacement for a woman they had loved, and they would not allow her to forget it. It was Dinah, ever practical, who first noticed that Catherine needed more direct help. The existing house slaves were loyal to Patience and the old ways of the house. Catherine, to truly be the mistress, needed someone loyal only to her. She broached the subject with Isaiah one evening, framing it as a matter of household efficiency. After days of stony consideration, he relented. He would purchase a young house slave for her, someone who could be trained to her specific needs. The opportunity arrived with a letter from his younger brother, Thomas, a gregarious bachelor who managed the family's business interests from Richmond. He was traveling to Charleston and offered to attend the slave auctions on Isaiah's behalf. Isaiah sent back his requirements: a healthy female, between 15 and 25. Strong, but with a refined manner. Literate, if possible. And the price was not to exceed $800. It was a simple transaction, a straightforward purchase. But neither Isaiah nor Thomas could possibly know that in the humid, desperate air of Charleston's slave markets, deception was a commodity as valuable as human flesh itself. And a purchase was about to be made that would bring a secret to Riverwood far darker than the grief already haunting its halls. Ryan's Mart on Chalmers Street in Charleston was a 3-story brick building that processed human lives with the brutal efficiency of a slaughterhouse. The air inside was thick and heavy, a foul cocktail of unwashed bodies, chewing tobacco, and the metallic tang of pure, undiluted fear. It was here, on April 14th, that Thomas Vanderhorst found himself pressed amidst a crowd of buyers from across the South, his brother's money in his pocket, and his brother's instructions committed to memory. Thomas, for all his Richmond sophistication, was out of his element. The scale of the Charleston market was overwhelming. The auctioneer, Samuel Pritchard, was a heavy-set man with a voice like grinding stones, moving through his lots with a practiced, almost bored cruelty. The first dozen sales were strong young men, field hands destined for the malarial rice plantations of the Low Country. Thomas waited, his unease growing with each crack of the gavel. Then Pritchard changed his tone. "Now, gentlemen," he boomed, "we turn to the domestic staff, a finer class of merchandise for your homes. First up, lot number 47, a healthy female, name of Grace, approximately 17 years of age, fully trained in all household duties." A slight figure was led onto the auction block. Thomas leaned forward, his interest piqued. The person standing there was slender, perhaps 5'4", with skin the color of polished mahogany. She wore a simple, faded blue cotton dress, and her eyes remained fixed on the floorboards as Pritchard began his pitch. "Grace comes to us from the estate of the late Mrs. Henrietta Gadsden, a fine Christian woman," Pritchard announced. "She served as a lady's maid for 3 years. She is literate, gentlemen, taught her letters by Mrs. Gadsden herself. Note the refinement of her hands. These are not the hands of a field worker. She is proficient in laundering, mending, hairdressing, and managing a lady's correspondence. A rare find, indeed." Thomas studied the figure on the block. Her hair was wrapped in a tignon, the traditional head covering. Her posture was one of deep submission, shoulders hunched, hands clasped tightly at her waist. At Pritchard's command, she turned slowly, her movements small and deliberate. The dress, though worn, was cut for a female form, and everything about her suggested a life spent indoors, away from the brutal labor of the fields. "Can she speak?" a man shouted from the back. Pritchard gestured to Grace. "Yes, master," she said, her voice soft, high, and slightly breathless. "I can speak, and I can read from the Holy Bible and cipher my numbers." It was Thomas who spoke next. "What household tasks can you perform?" Her eyes never left the floor. "I can dress a lady's hair in the latest fashion, master. I can maintain a wardrobe, clean and press fine garments, prepare medicinal teas, and assist with correspondence. Mrs. Gadsden trained me with care before her passing." The accent was pure Low Country, but the grammar was startlingly precise. Thomas felt a surge of confidence. This was it. This was exactly what Isaiah wanted, what Catherine needed. Refined, literate, and from a respectable estate. "Any health issues?" another bidder called out. Pritchard shook his head with theatrical vigor. "Sound in body and mind, examined 2 days ago by Dr. Marcus Waverly. His certification is included with the bill of sale. No signs of consumption, dropsy, or any female complaints. Her cycle is regular, according to the estate records." The last detail was a crude necessity of the trade, a confirmation of breeding potential. The bidding opened at $400. Thomas watched, letting 2 other men drive the price up. At $725, one of them hesitated. Thomas saw his opening. $750, he called out, his voice firm and clear. A hush fell. The other bidder glanced at Grace one last time, then shook his head and stepped back. Pritchard's gavel crashed down. "Sold! To the gentleman in the gray coat for $750. At the clerk's table, the paperwork was completed. The bill of sale described Grace as a Negro female, approx. 17 years, sound in body, literate. Thomas, pleased with his purchase, paid the sum and took the documents. He didn't scrutinize them. He had no reason to. He didn't notice that the ink used to designate Grace's gender was a fraction of a shade different from the rest of the text. He didn't see that the signature of the supposed Dr. Waverly looked just a little too perfect, as if traced by a careful, forging hand. He saw only what he expected to see. What Thomas and Isaiah and everyone at Riverwood could not yet know was that Grace was the product of a desperate, lifelong deception. Born on a plantation near Georgetown, Grace had entered the world with ambiguous anatomy, a condition the 19th century world had no name for, only fear and revulsion. Her mother, Ruth, in a moment of sharp, terrified clarity, had made a choice in the birthing room. She had declared her child a girl. She raised Grace as female, teaching her to move, to speak, to carry herself in a way that would never invite questions. It was a constant performance. As Grace grew, her body didn't always cooperate with the narrative, but Ruth was resourceful. Tight bindings under layers of clothing concealed the truth. Grace was taught only the tasks of a house slave, keeping her away from the communal quarters and the prying eyes of the fields. For 17 years, the secret held. Grace learned to inhabit the role so completely it became her reality. But it was a fragile reality, one that could be shattered by a single careless moment, or a single medical examination. Now, after the deaths of her mother and then her mistress, Mrs. Gadsden, she stood sold once more, following Thomas Vanderhorst toward a new life in Virginia. She played the part she had been assigned at birth, her mind a fortress of secrets, her every step a calculated risk. She was heading for Riverwood Plantation, a place of secrets itself, praying that whatever awaited her there, she could keep her own buried just a little while longer. But some secrets, once planted in the soil of a place like Riverwood, have a way of taking root and growing into something monstrous. Grace arrived at Riverwood on a humid April afternoon, under a sky bruised with the threat of a coming storm. Isaiah Vanderhorst met them on the porch, his eyes appraising his new property with a cold, dispassionate gaze. Grace stood with her small bundle of possessions at her feet, head bowed, a perfect portrait of submission. "She seems suitable," Isaiah pronounced after a long, unnerving silence. "Catherine can assess her capabilities." "Patience," he called out. "Take her to the house. She'll room in the attic." Patience, her own face a mask of careful neutrality, led Grace away. As she walked towards the servants' entrance, Grace allowed herself one quick, furtive glance at the great house. It looked solid, permanent, inescapable. It looked like every other prison she had ever known. The next morning, Catherine met her new servant. In the small sitting room adjacent to her bedroom, Catherine sat in a straight-backed chair, observing the girl who stood before her. Dinah had already described Grace as peculiar quiet and thin as a marsh reed. Catherine saw something else. There was a stillness about Grace, a profound self-containment that was unusual. "I'm told you were trained in Charleston," Catherine began, her voice businesslike. "Can you dress hair?" "Yes, mistress," Grace replied softly. "I know several fashions." "Show me." For the next 20 minutes, Grace worked on Catherine's hair, her hands gentle but sure. Catherine watched her in the mirror, evaluating not just the skill, but the demeanor. She noticed how Grace moved, with an almost theatrical economy of gesture, as if she were constantly aware of the space she occupied, always trying to make it smaller. It was an exaggerated femininity, a role performed with meticulous precision. But Catherine, a woman who had spent her entire life performing a role herself, simply filed the observation away. The days settled into a routine. Grace assisted Dinah. She mended linens. She kept Catherine's chambers in perfect order. She was exactly what Isaiah had purchased. An efficient, unobtrusive servant. But in the long, silent afternoons, as the Virginia heat pressed down on the house, something began to shift. It started with the discovery of Grace's literacy. Catherine, bored and lonely, found Grace one afternoon gazing at an open book, her lips moving silently. "You like stories?" Catherine asked. Startled, Grace immediately apologized. "I asked if you like stories," Catherine repeated. "Yes, mistress. Mrs. Gadsden. She used to have me read to her when her eyes grew weak." An idea sparked in Catherine's mind. The isolation had become a crushing weight. The prospect of hearing a voice fill the silent hours, of being transported by a narrative, was an irresistible temptation. "Every afternoon," Catherine announced, "you will read to me." And so began their ritual. In the privacy of Catherine's sitting room, with the door closed against the rest of the house, Grace read aloud. They moved from tedious historical novels to Shakespeare's comedies, and Grace's voice, surprisingly expressive, brought the characters to life. Gradually, the strict boundary between mistress and servant began to blur. Catherine would interrupt to comment on a passage. Grace slowly, cautiously, began to offer her own observations. In that room, they were not mistress and slave. They were simply two intelligent, lonely people finding a fragile connection in the world of words. Dinah saw the growing familiarity, and it worried her. "Mistress Catherine," she warned one morning, "you're getting mighty close with that Grace girl. It ain't wise. Mr. Isaiah is a particular sort of man." Catherine dismissed the warning, but it lingered. She told herself their friendship was harmless, but she also became more careful, ensuring their afternoon sessions remained a secret. For Grace, every moment in that house was a tightrope walk over a chasm of discovery. The shared attic room required constant vigilance. She changed her clothes only when absolutely necessary, her back turned, citing a modesty the other slaves eventually accepted as a quirk. She bathed late at night, alone in the kitchen by the light of a single candle. She managed the physical realities of her body with a complex system of bindings and rags, laundered in secret. The regular monthly cycle Pritchard had advertised was a fiction, a lie she maintained by feigning female troubles once a month, a complaint common enough to pass without question. During those days, she would lie on her cot, binding herself even more tightly, praying no one would ever have cause to look too closely. By late June, the unspoken current between Catherine and Grace had grown stronger, more dangerous. It was in the small gestures, a hand that lingered a moment too long, a gaze held in the mirror that stretched beyond propriety. Both women told themselves it was nothing. For Catherine, it was gratitude for companionship. For Grace, it was a strategy for survival. But they were both lying. They felt the charge in the air, the way their reading sessions had begun to feel like a secret, intimate world, built for just the two of them. One sweltering afternoon in early July, the pretense finally shattered. Catherine had been weeping silently as Grace read a poem about lost love. The words had pierced Catherine's carefully constructed composure, reminding her of all the dreams she'd had to surrender. Grace stopped reading. She knelt by Catherine's daybed and, with infinite gentleness, took her hand. "I am sorry for your sadness, mistress," she whispered. The simple, genuine empathy in her voice broke Catherine completely. She gripped Grace's hand and wept, and Grace stayed there, kneeling, holding her, offering a silent, solid comfort that no one else in that house ever had. After that day, everything was different. The unspoken had become undeniable. The afternoon readings continued, but now they sat side by side on the daybed, their shoulders sometimes touching. They existed in a state of deliberate denial, finding solace in a connection that every law of God and man in 1847 Virginia forbade. What neither of them realized was that their secret world was about to collide with the cold, hard reality of biology, and a new life, conceived in that impossible intimacy, was about to expose them all. In mid-September, the carefully constructed world of Riverwood tilted on its axis. It happened during breakfast. Catherine stood abruptly, her face the color of ash, and collapsed into Dinah's arms. Isaiah, irritated, ordered her taken upstairs and sent for Dr. Kemp. Dr. Howard Kemp was a young, ambitious physician, new to the county. After a brief examination of Catherine, he emerged from her bedroom with a professionally pleased smile and delivered the news to Isaiah. "Congratulations are in order, Mr. Vanderhorst," he announced. "Your wife shows every sign of being with child. I'd estimate she's 6 to 8 weeks along." Isaiah stood perfectly still. For a long, unnerving moment, he said nothing. Then, "You're certain?" "As certain as one can be at this stage," Dr. Kemp confirmed. "There is every reason to expect a successful outcome." After the doctor left, Isaiah stood on the front porch for over an hour, smoking, his face a stone mask. He did not go to see his wife. Instead, when evening fell, he locked himself in his study. He opened his personal diary, a ledger of his own life, and began to count. He traced the calendar with his finger, going backwards from mid-September. 6 weeks, 8 weeks. He had been away on business for most of July and all of August. His last visit to Catherine's bedroom had been a single, perfunctory encounter in the middle of July. Before that, weeks had passed. The arithmetic was wrong. It felt profoundly, fundamentally wrong. Upstairs, Catherine lay in her bed, her mind reeling. When Grace came to her that evening, she finally voiced the terror that had been screaming in her mind. "This isn't possible," she whispered, her hand hovering over her own stomach. "Isaiah, we haven't. Not since July. How can I be pregnant?" Grace sat on the edge of the bed, her expression carefully neutral. "The doctor seemed certain, mistress." "I know my own body, Grace," Catherine insisted. "I know how this happens, and it hasn't happened." Her eyes met Grace's, a desperate, pleading search for an explanation. For a fleeting second, a look passed between them, a flicker of an impossible, terrifying truth. Then Grace looked away, the shutter falling, the mask back in place. "Perhaps," Grace said quietly, her voice betraying nothing. "It is possible, even so." But Catherine had seen it. She had seen that flicker in Grace's eyes. The seed of a question, too monstrous to even form into a coherent thought, was planted in her mind. Was it possible? Could their intimacy, their gentle, clothed embraces, have resulted in this? It defied everything she had ever been taught about the world. And yet, the child inside her was real. What would you have done in Catherine's position? Trapped in a loveless marriage, pregnant with a child you cannot explain, with the only person you trust holding a secret that could destroy you both. Would you demand the truth, no matter the cost? Or would you cling to the impossible, praying the lie will hold? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. As the weeks passed, Catherine's pregnancy progressed. The morning sickness came and went. Her body began to change. Dr. Kemp made his visits, satisfied with her health, predicting a birth in late April. Isaiah received these updates with a quiet, unsettling calm, but he had begun to watch her. At dinner, she would look up and find his eyes on her, cold and calculating. He began asking careful, probing questions of the house staff, about her routines, her visitors, about how much time exactly she spent alone with her lady's maid. Dinah, ever watchful, saw the danger gathering like a storm. "Mr. Isaiah is suspicious," she warned Catherine in a hushed, urgent tone. "He's looking for something. Whatever is happening between you and that Grace girl, it needs to stop. This is his plantation. He is the law here. And if he decides someone has wronged him, people could die. But Catherine couldn't stop. Her connection with Grace was the only warmth in her frozen life. Instead of sending Grace away, she pulled her closer. She had Grace move from the attic to a pallet in her dressing room, claiming she needed attendance during the night. In truth, she couldn't bear to be alone with her fear. In the darkness, they became lovers in a more profound sense, sharing confessions and terrors in whispers. And in those whispers, Catherine found the courage to ignore the growing dread. Grace, meanwhile, was living in a state of suspended terror. She knew the truth of Catherine's pregnancy. It had been a moment of recklessness, born of desperation and a desire so powerful it had overwhelmed her lifelong caution. Now, the consequence was growing in Catherine's womb, a living time bomb. Every day was a gamble. Every quiet moment with Catherine was a stolen treasure and a terrible risk. The breaking point came in early December. A letter arrived from Thomas in Richmond. On a recent business trip back to Charleston, he'd had a chance encounter with Samuel Pritchard, the auctioneer. Thomas, mentioning his purchase of Grace, had noted the man's sudden discomfort. His curiosity piqued. Thomas had done some digging. He'd discovered that the physician on the health certificate, Dr. Marcus Waverly, did not exist. He'd re-examined his copy of the bill of sale, and this time he saw the subtle forgery, the different inks. His letter to Isaiah was carefully worded, but its implication was a thunderclap. Something about Grace's sale was a fraud. Her very identity was a lie. Isaiah read the letter 3 times. Then he sat in his study, the letter on the desk before him, drinking whiskey as the afternoon light faded. He thought of his wife's impossible pregnancy. He thought of Grace's delicate features and quiet presence. He thought of the closed door to his wife's sitting room. By the time darkness fell, every piece of the puzzle had clicked into place, forming a picture of betrayal so monstrous it defied imagination. He had made his decision. He would have the truth. And then he would have his revenge. The next morning, a messenger was sent to fetch Dr. Kemp. He was needed at Riverwood for an urgent medical matter. Not for the pregnant mistress of the house. This was for the slave named Grace. A thorough examination was required. When Dr. Kemp arrived at Riverwood on the morning of December 11th, the air was cold and still, holding the promise of the first winter snow. He was shown directly to Isaiah's study. The master of Riverwood sat behind his desk, his face grim. Thomas's letter from Charleston laid open before him like a death warrant. "Doctor," Isaiah began, his voice devoid of all warmth, "I require your professional discretion. I need you to perform a medical examination on one of my slaves, Grace." "Has she shown signs of illness?" Dr. Kemp asked, opening his medical bag. Isaiah's eyes were like chips of ice. "I need you to confirm her sex." The request hung in the air, bizarre and disturbing. "Mr. Vanderhorst," the doctor stammered, "that is a highly unusual—" "It becomes a medical matter," Isaiah cut in, his voice hardening, "when it concerns my wife's pregnancy. A pregnancy conceived when I was largely absent, by a woman attended daily by a slave whose very documentation is a fraud. I require clarity, doctor. I need to know exactly what I purchased." The horrific implication finally dawned on Dr. Kemp. His face went pale. He was a man of medicine, not a participant in a planter's brutal inquisition. But he was also a man who depended on the patronage of families like the Vanderhorsts. To refuse was to risk his practice, his livelihood. With a slow, reluctant nod, he agreed. Grace was summoned to a small, disused sewing room on the first floor. Patience led her to the door, her old face a mask of pity and sorrow, then retreated. Isaiah and Dr. Kemp entered, locking the door behind them. Grace stood in the center of the room, her hands clasped. She didn't have to ask why she was there. She knew. After 17 years of performance, the curtain was finally coming down. In a strange way, it was almost a relief. The strain of the secret had been a heavier burden than any chains. "Remove your clothing," Isaiah commanded, his voice cold and flat. Grace looked at him then, her eyes meeting his for the first time. There was no fear in her gaze, only a profound, weary resignation. She began to undress slowly, deliberately, folding each garment with a care that seemed surreal under the circumstances. When she stood naked before them, the truth was irrefutable. The lifetime of careful binding was gone, revealing a body that defied the simple categories of their world. She was intersex, her anatomy a testament to the secret her mother had tried to bury. Isaiah stared, his face unreadable, then turned sharply to the window. "Make your examination thorough, Doctor. I want every detail documented." Dr. Kemp approached Grace, his own hands trembling slightly. "I'm sorry," he whispered, too low for Isaiah to hear. Then, with a clinical detachment he did not feel, he began his work, noting his observations in a small, leather-bound journal. Grace stood perfectly still, her mind a blank slate, her spirit having retreated to a place where they could not touch it. The examination took 20 minutes. When it was done, Dr. Kemp allowed Grace to dress. He turned to Isaiah, his journal in hand. "Your suspicions were correct," he said, his voice strained. "The individual presents with characteristics of both sexes. The bill of sale was, unequivocally, a misrepresentation." Isaiah's jaw clenched. "And conception? Is it possible for this person to father a child?" Dr. Kemp hesitated, then gave the answer dictated by his observations. "Based on my examination, yes, physiologically it would be possible." Isaiah closed his eyes. The final, damning piece of evidence. He turned back to Grace, his body shaking with a rage so profound it was almost silent. "How long?" he hissed. "How long have you been in my wife's bed, playing this part, while fathering a child on her?" "She didn't know," Grace said, her voice quiet but steady. "Catherine never knew. She believed I was what I appeared to be. She is innocent in this." The words sent Isaiah over the edge. He lunged forward, striking Grace across the face with the back of his hand, sending her sprawling to the floor. "Do not," he spat, "speak her name." He left her there, locking the door behind him. Grace was later moved by patients to a cold equipment shed behind the slave quarters. She was left in the dark with a bucket of water and a piece of bread, to await a judgment she knew would be merciless. Upstairs, Catherine knew nothing. It wasn't until that evening that Dinah, her face tight with fear, told her what had happened. That Dr. Kemp had examined Grace. That Grace was now locked in the shed. That Thomas had arrived from Richmond and was closeted with Isaiah in the study. Catherine felt the world drop out from under her. She flew to the study, demanding to see her husband. It was Thomas who met her at the door, his face etched with pity. "Go to your room, Catherine," he urged gently. "Isaiah is working through some difficult information." "What information?" she demanded. "What did he discover about Grace?" Thomas's voice dropped to a whisper. "He discovered everything." Catherine went back to her room and sat in the dark, the pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. Isaiah knew. He knew about Grace's body. He knew about the pregnancy. He knew their secret world had been built on a lie, and he was now the sole arbiter of their fate. She could deny it. She could feign ignorance and shock, paint herself as a victim. It was the safe path, the one that might save her own life. But as she sat there, the child stirring within her, she made a different choice. She thought of Grace, alone and cold in the shed. She thought of the only person who had ever seen her. truly seen her. She would not let Grace face Isaiah's wrath alone. If he was going to destroy the person she loved, he would have to destroy her too. Whatever fire was coming, she would walk into it with her eyes wide open. The confrontation came the next morning. Isaiah summoned Catherine to his study. Thomas was there, as was a pale and deeply uncomfortable Dr. Kemp. Isaiah stood behind his desk, the doctor's written report spread out before him like an indictment. "I have some questions for you," Isaiah began, his voice dangerously quiet, "and I expect the truth." He did not waste time with subtlety. "How long have you been having relations with Grace?" Catherine felt the eyes of all three men on her. This was the moment to lie, to save herself. The sensible, survivalist instinct screamed at her to play the part of the deceived, horrified wife. Instead, she looked her husband directly in the eye and spoke a truth that sealed her fate and Grace's. "I love her," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Him. Whatever term you prefer. I love Grace. And yes, we were intimate." She took a breath. "I did not know Grace was anything other than a woman. I thought the child must be yours, because I could not imagine another possibility. But if you are saying Grace is the father, then I believe you." The confession landed in the room with the force of a physical blow. Thomas stared at her, aghast. Dr. Kemp looked at the floor. Isaiah himself seemed momentarily stunned by her audacity. "You are confessing to adultery?" he finally managed, his voice trembling with rage. "To sodomy? To crimes that could see you both hanged?" "Yes," Catherine said. "I suppose I am. So what will you do, Isaiah? Will you drag us before a public court? Will you stand before all of Hanover County and explain how your wife preferred a slave of uncertain gender to you? How will that story serve your pride?" She had him, and in his face she saw the sickening realization that she was right. He was trapped. He could not punish them without exposing himself to a humiliation no Virginia gentleman could endure. It was Thomas who, ever the pragmatist, offered a way out. A private tribunal, a few trusted magistrates who could keep their mouths shut. A story would be concocted. Grace, the deceitful predator. Catherine, the innocent, naive victim. The judgment would be swift, the secret buried. Grace would be sold south to disappear into the brutal anonymity of the sugar plantations. Catherine would be sent away until after the child was born, a child who would then be given away, never to be acknowledged. "And if I want them both dead?" Isaiah snarled. "I'd advise against it," Thomas replied coolly. "A quiet disappearance is cleaner." Isaiah looked at Catherine, his eyes filled not with hatred but with a cold, dead disgust. "You will be gone from this house within the week," he decreed. "You will go to Charleston. You will never see the child. You will never speak of this again. If you do, I will have you committed to an asylum for the insane." "Can I see her?" Catherine asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Before I leave?" "Absolutely not," Isaiah said. "For all you know, she is already dead." The tribunal was a formality, a quiet, shameful proceeding held after dark in the Hanover County Courthouse. The verdict was exactly as Thomas had arranged. Grace was found guilty of fraud and assault, Catherine judged to be a victim of her own poor judgment. The official record was sealed, the truth officially erased. The next day, Grace was taken from the equipment shed in chains and transported to a slave trader in Richmond, known for making problems disappear. Catherine left for Charleston 2 days later, her journey into exile marked by the silent judgment of her mother-in-law. In April of 1848, Catherine gave birth to a healthy baby boy. She was allowed to hold him for 2 hours. She memorized every line of his face, whispered promises she knew she could never keep. And then he was taken from her, sent to a farm family in a distant county to be raised under a different name. The news came that summer, in a letter from Thomas that Isaiah read aloud to her with deliberate cruelty. Grace had been sold to a sugar plantation near New Orleans. She had lasted 4 months before dying of fever and exhaustion. The words broke something in Catherine that never healed. Grace was dead. Her son was gone. She was now a prisoner in a marriage of suffocating silence. She lived on, a ghost haunting the halls of Riverwood, and later, a boarding house in Richmond. She never remarried. She never had other children. She carried her secrets to an unmarked grave in 1871. Her son, William, grew up never knowing the truth of his birth. Dr. Kemp fled Virginia, haunted by his role in the tragedy. The tribunal records were said to have burned in a courthouse fire, the story almost entirely wiped from history. Riverwood itself, as if cursed, eventually fell into ruin and burned to the ground. All that remains are fragments, a suspicious entry in a ledger, rumors of sealed documents, a local legend of something terrible that once happened on the Vanderhorst land, though no one remembers exactly what. History is not what is written in books. It is what survives. It is the stories that refuse to be completely erased, the whispers that linger in the archives. Grace and Catherine lived in a world that denied them their love, their child, and finally, their history. That we can piece together even this fragmented shadow of their story is a small act of defiance. It is a refusal to let them be forgotten. If this story stayed with you, tell me in the comments which part of it will linger in your mind the longest. And don't forget to subscribe for more journeys into the forgotten corners of history.